In the middle of the White Sea, just below the Arctic Circle, there sits a cluster of islands that look like a paradise from a distance. Ancient stone monasteries rise out of the mist, their onion domes reflecting the pale northern sun. But in 1929, this was no place of prayer. It was the Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp, known simply as Solovki. It was the grandfather of the Gulag, the laboratory where the Soviet Union learned how to turn human beings into dust. And on a brisk morning in June of that year, the camp was in a state of absolute terrified panic. They weren't afraid of the cold or the hunger or the lice that infested every inch of the prisoner barracks. They were afraid of a boat that was appearing on the horizon. On that boat was a man named Maxim Gorky. If you don't know the name, imagine a celebrity with the moral authority of a saint and the fame of a movie star. Gorky was the most famous writer in Russia, a man who championed the poor and the downtrodden. He had been living abroad, critical of the new Bolshevik regime, but Stalin had lured him back with a specific purpose. The West was beginning to hear rumors about the slave labor camps. They were hearing about the torture, the starvation, and the death. The Soviet Union needed a witness to prove them wrong. They needed Gorky to go to Solovki, look around, and tell the world that the Gulag was not a prison, but a school, a place where criminals were reforged into honest Soviet citizens. For the camp commanders, this was a matter of life and death. If Gorky saw the truth, if he saw the typhus patients rotting on the floor or the men tied to logs in the forest to be eaten alive by mosquitoes, he would write about it. And if he wrote about it, the commanders wouldn't just be fired, they would be executed. So, a frantic operation began. It was one of the greatest acts of theater in human history. The camp was scrubbed, the torture cells were hidden, the starving prisoners, the goners who looked like walking skeletons, were loaded onto barges and shipped to remote corners of the archipelago, hidden away like dirty laundry. In their place, the guards selected the healthiest prisoners. They gave them new clothes, they gave them books, they set up tables with tablecloths, they even planted fully grown fir trees along the path Gorky would walk, cutting them from the woods and sticking them into the ground without roots, just to make the landscape look prettier for a few hours. It was a Potemkin village, a fake reality constructed of wood and fear. But amidst this carefully choreographed lie, there was one variable they forgot to control, one loose thread that threatened to unravel the entire tapestry of deceit. It wasn't a guard with a conscience. It wasn't a hidden diary. It was a 14-year-old boy, a boy whose name would be erased from the archives, whose face would be scrubbed from the photos, but whose courage would become the stuff of dark legend. As ERASED steamship whistle blew, signaling Gorky's arrival, the boy was watching from the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew something the guards didn't. He knew that today he was going to die. But first, he was going to speak. The gangplank lowered, and Maxim Gorky stepped onto the holy soil of Solovki. He was an old man with a walrus mustache, wrapped in a heavy coat, looking around with eyes that wanted to believe the best. He was accompanied by high-ranking NKVD officers, men with cold smiles and revolvers hidden under their leather jackets. They guided him like a precious, fragile doll. "Look here, Maxim Maximovich," they would say, pointing to a group of prisoners sitting on a bench. "See how they relax? See how they read?" Gorky approached the prisoners. He saw men holding newspapers, nodding intelligently. He smiled, nodding back. What he didn't see, or perhaps what he chose not to see, was the terror in their eyes. He didn't notice that some of the newspapers were upside down because the men were shaking so hard they couldn't focus. He didn't know that just an hour before, a guard had walked down the line and whispered, "If anyone complains, if anyone cries, if anyone asks for bread, you will be shot behind the latrines before the sun sets." So the prisoners smiled. It was a smile of survival, a rictus of fear masquerading as gratitude. The tour continued. They took Gorky to the children's colony. Yes, there were children in the Gulag, street urchins, petty thieves, or just the children of enemies of the people. Usually, these kids lived in squalor, fighting the rats for scraps of food. But today, Gorky walked into a clean, bright room. The children were dressed in fresh uniforms. There were no lice crawling on the walls. There was no smell of unwashed bodies. The commanders had transformed a hellhole into a kindergarten in 48 hours. Gorky sat down. He patted a child on the head. He asked them about their studies. "We are learning to be good citizens," the children chirped in unison, reciting the lines they had been beaten into memorizing the night before. Gorky took out his notebook. He wrote, "Here, the state educates, it does not punish." The commanders exchanged glances behind his back. It was working. The great writer was buying the lie. They were safe. They walked him toward the infirmary, which had been cleared of the dying and filled with patients who were actually off-duty guards in pajamas, pretending to recover from minor colds. It was a masterclass in deception. Every step Gorky took was guided. Every view was curated. It was as if he were walking through a movie set where the props were human beings. But reality is hard to suppress completely. The atmosphere was thick with tension. It hummed in the air like a high-voltage wire. The prisoners who were watching from a distance, the ones who hadn't been selected for the play, stood silently by the barbed wire. They were transmitting a silent scream. "Look closer," they willed him. "Look at our hands. Look at the graves in the forest." And as the tour group moved toward the central square, that silent scream finally found a voice. The deception was perfect. The actors were in place. But suddenly, the crowd parted. A small figure emerged from the sea of gray jackets. He didn't have a script. He didn't have a smile. He was a skinny, pale boy with eyes that burned with the intensity of a fanatic. He stepped directly into Gorky's path, blocking the great man's way. The guards froze. The commandant's hand twitched toward his holster. The play was about to crash. The silence that fell over the Solovetsky courtyard was heavier than the stones of the monastery walls. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the lungs of every man, woman, and guard present. In the center of this silence stood the boy. He couldn't have been more than 14. He was small for his age, stunted by malnutrition, his uniform slightly too big for his skeletal frame. But it was his face that stopped the world. It was a face that had aged 1,000 years in a single winter. His eyes were dark, deep pits of absolute seriousness. He didn't tremble. He didn't look at the ground. He looked straight up into the eyes of Maxim Gorky, the most famous writer in the Soviet Union. The guards were paralyzed. You have to understand the impossible position they were in. In any other situation, on any other day, a prisoner who broke ranks and approached a superior would be beaten into unconsciousness instantly. If a prisoner spoke without permission, they were silenced with a rifle butt. But this was the one moment where the rules of violence were suspended. They couldn't shoot a child in front of Gorky. They couldn't beat him while the international press was waiting for a report on the humanity of the camp. The commandant, a man named Eichmanns, stood frozen, his face draining of blood. He knew that the facade they had built over the last 48 hours was made of paper, and this boy was holding a match. Gorky looked down at the child. The writer's mustache twitched. He was a man who prided himself on understanding the Russian soul, on being the voice of the people. Here was the people. Not the sanitized, smiling actors he had seen all morning, but something raw and unscripted. Gorky leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "What is it, little one?" he asked. His voice was kind, the voice of a grandfather. "Do you have a poem to recite? Did you forget your lines?" The boy didn't blink. He didn't smile at the condescending tone. "I don't have a poem," the boy said. His voice was clear, cutting through the icy wind like a bell. "I have the truth. Everything you have seen today is a lie." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered officers. The commandant took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to physically grab the words out of the air. "He is confused, Comrade Gorky," the commandant stammered, his smile looking like a rictus of pain. "He is a disturbed child, a thief. He imagines things." The boy ignored the commandant completely. He kept his eyes locked on Gorky. "They painted the walls yesterday," the boy said. "They hid the sick in the forest. They gave us these clothes this morning. If you want to know what Solovki is really like, you have to listen to me, not them." The tension was unbearable. It was a standoff between the entire weight of the Soviet propaganda machine and one skinny 14-year-old boy. The guards were vibrating with the urge to violence, their knuckles white on their rifles. They were waiting for a signal, any signal, to drag the boy away. But Gorky didn't give the signal. He was intrigued. Perhaps it was his writer's instinct, sniffing out a story. Perhaps it was a flicker of genuine conscience. He looked at the commandant, then back at the boy. "You say it is a lie?" Gorky asked softly. "I can prove it," the boy said, "but not here, not with them listening. I need to speak to you alone." The commandant let out a nervous laugh. "Alone?" "Comrade Gorky, this is highly irregular. For your own safety." Gorky stood up straight. The kindness vanished from his face, replaced by the arrogance of a celebrity who knows he is the most powerful man in the room. He waved his hand dismissively at the commandant. "I am not afraid of a child," Gorky declared. "If the Soviet system is as robust as you say, it can withstand the complaints of a boy. I will hear him out." Gorky gestured to the nearest building, the administration block. "We will go in there. Alone." The boy nodded and began to walk toward the door. Gorky followed. The heavy wooden door creaked open, swallowing them both, and then slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. The lock clicked, and on the outside, the commandant and his men were left standing in the cold, staring at the closed door, knowing that their careers and likely their lives were now being decided by the testimony of a child they had failed to silence. The door was made of thick oak, reinforced with iron bands, a relic from the time when monks lived on the island. But to the NKVD officers standing outside, it might as well have been transparent glass, because their imaginations were painting a picture of what was happening inside that terrified them more than reality ever could. The commandant, Eichmanns, began to pace, back and forth, back and forth. His boots crunched on the gravel, a metronome of anxiety. He lit a cigarette, took 2 drags and threw it away. Then he lit another. Inside that room, there was no script. There was no Potemkin village. There was just a boy unloading the accumulated trauma of thousands of men. We don't have a transcript of that conversation. The Soviets, in their obsession with erasing history, ensured that no record survived. But we know from the survivors of Solovki, from the memoirs of men like Solzhenitsyn, exactly what the boy would have told him. He would have told him about the mosquito pole. In the summer, the guards would take prisoners who hadn't met their quota, strip them naked, and tie them to a pole in the middle of the forest. The Solovetsky mosquitoes are thick clouds of biting misery. Within an hour, a man is swollen beyond recognition. Within 4 hours, he is delirious from blood loss and toxin shock. The boy would have told Gorky about this. He would have told him about Sukurka Hill. The church at the top of the hill had been turned into a punishment cell. It was unheated. Men were forced to sit on narrow poles, balancing all night. If they fell off, they were beaten. And outside the church, there was a steep wooden staircase with 365 steps leading down the mountain. The guards had a game. They would take a prisoner, tie him to a heavy log, and kick him down the stairs. The sound of the body bouncing, the bones breaking against the wood and ice, it was the soundtrack of the camp. The boy knew this sound. Maybe he had heard it. Maybe he had seen it. 40 minutes passed, then 50. Outside, the silence of the guards had turned into a thick, suffocating dread. They knew that every minute the door remained closed was another nail in their coffins. Why was Gorky listening for so long? If the boy was just lying, Gorky would have walked out in 5 minutes, laughing. The fact that he stayed meant he was believing. It meant the carefully constructed lie was crumbling. The commandant whispered to his deputy, "If he comes out angry, if he orders an investigation, we are finished. I want a boat ready. We might have to run." It was a ridiculous thought. There was nowhere to run from Stalin, but panic makes men think irrationally. Inside the room, the boy was likely rolling up his sleeves. He wasn't just using words anymore. He was showing the scars, the bruises, the evidence written on his own skin. He was showing Gorky the black hands of the frostbite, the lice bites, the marks of the whip. He was holding up a mirror to the great humanist, forcing him to look at the monster he was defending. An hour passed. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the courtyard. The other prisoners, who had been kept at a distance, were watching the door with a mix of hope and terror. They whispered among themselves, "The boy is doing it. He is saving us. Gorky will go back to Moscow and tell Stalin. They will close the camp. They will send food. Hope is a dangerous thing in the Gulag. It makes the fall that much harder. And then, finally, the handle of the door turned. The sound was sharp and mechanical. The pacing commandant froze. The guards snapped to attention. The door swung open slowly. The first thing they saw was Gorky. The great writer filled the doorway. But he didn't look like the confident celebrity who had entered. His hat was in his hand. His shoulders were slumped. And as he stepped out into the biting wind, the guards saw something that made their blood run cold, but for a completely different reason. Maxim Gorky was weeping. Tears were streaming down his face into his gray mustache. He was sobbing openly, shaking with emotion. He turned back to the room where the small boy stood in the shadows. Gorky didn't speak. He just looked at the boy with an expression of profound, devastating pity. The commandant let out a breath he had been holding for an hour. Tears. Tears were good. Tears meant the writer was moved. Tears meant emotion, not anger. But what kind of emotion? Was it the sorrow of a man who has realized he is an accomplice to a crime? Or was it the theatrical sorrow of an actor who has just watched a tragic play? The suspense hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Gorky wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, put his hat back on, and looked at the commandant. The boy stepped out of the darkness, standing beside the writer. The boy looked exhausted, emptied out, but triumphant. He thought he had won. He thought the tears were his victory. He had no idea that he had just signed his own death warrant. The courtyard remained frozen in a tableau of confusion. Maxim Gorky, the titan of Soviet literature, stood there wiping tears from his cheeks with a white handkerchief. The boy stood beside him, his small chest heaving with the adrenaline of the last hour. To the hundreds of prisoners watching from behind the barbed wire perimeter, this looked like a miracle. In the visual language of the Russian soul, tears are the ultimate currency. Tears mean repentance. Tears mean a breakthrough. The prisoners nudged each other, whispering with a frantic, desperate hope. "He heard him," they hissed. "The old man heard the truth. Look at him weeping. He's going to save us." The commandant, however, saw something different. He was a predator, and he knew how to read fear. He watched Gorky carefully. He saw that the writer's tears were not accompanied by anger. Gorky wasn't shouting at the guards. He wasn't demanding the arrest of the torture squad. He was simply sad. It was a passive, impotent sadness. The commandant stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel, breaking the spell. "Maxim Maximovich," the commandant said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "You are exhausted. The journey, the emotion. This child has clearly upset you with his fantasies. Please, let us take you to the officers' mess. We have prepared a dinner, salmon, caviar, vodka." Gorky blew his nose loudly. He looked at the boy one last time. It was a look that has been debated by historians for decades. Was it a look of apology? Was it a look of guilt? Or was it the look of a man who was closing a book he didn't like? Gorky patted the boy on the shoulder, a heavy, final pat, and then turned away. "Yes," Gorky said, his voice thick. "Yes, I'm tired. The imagination of a child is a powerful thing. It is tragic." Tragic. He called it tragic. He didn't call it criminal. He didn't call it a revelation. He called it a tragedy, as if the boy's suffering was a piece of fiction to be critiqued. Gorky allowed the guards to guide him away toward the warmth of the administration building. He didn't look back. The boy was left standing alone in the center of the square. The spotlight of the great man's attention had moved on. Now, he was just a prisoner again. The guards looked at the commandant for orders. "What about the boy?" a sergeant whispered. "To the isolator?" The commandant smiled a thin, tight smile. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet. Gorky is still on the island. If we drag him away now, he might hear the screaming. Let the boy go back to his barracks. Let him think he is a hero. Let the other prisoners celebrate. It will make the lesson sharper when we teach it." The guards shoved the boy toward the prisoner barracks. He walked with his head high. He entered the dark, stinking room like a conquering king. The other men surrounded him, clapping him on the back, offering him their meager rations of bread. "What did you tell him?" they asked. "Did you tell him about the Pole? Did you tell him about the cold?" "I told him everything," the boy said, his eyes shining in the gloom. "I told him about the executions. I told him about the lice, and he cried. You saw him. He cried. He is going to write about it. He is going to tell Stalin, we are going to go home." The barracks erupted in a low murmur of joy. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of Solovki seemed to lift. They believed in the power of the written word. They believed that the truth, once spoken, could not be ignored. They were naive. They didn't understand that for men like Gorky and for the Soviet state, the truth was flexible. The truth was whatever served the revolution. And that night, as the boy slept the deep sleep of the righteous, dreaming of his mother and freedom, the commandant sat in his office, drinking vodka with Gorky, laughing at jokes and checking his watch. He was counting the minutes until the steamship departed. He was counting the minutes until he could reclaim his camp. The next morning broke with a gray, leaden sky. The fog rolled in off the white sea, shrouding the monastery towers in a ghostly veil. It was departure day. The steamship Gleb Boki, named after one of the founders of the Gulag system, sat at the dock, its smokestack belching black soot into the pristine Arctic air. The camp was assembled for the farewell ceremony. The orchestra, composed of imprisoned musicians from the best conservatories in St. Petersburg, played a rousing patriotic march. Maxim Gorky stood on the deck of the ship, wrapped in furs. He looked rested. The tears of the previous day were gone, replaced by the stoic expression of a statesman. He waved to the crowd. He waved to the commandant. He waved to the guards. He did not wave to the prisoners. They were kept in the Havre background, a gray mass of silent witnesses. The boy was there, pressed against the wire of the holding pen. He watched the man he thought was his savior. He was waiting for a sign. He was waiting for Gorky to point at him, to say, "And that boy comes with me." He was waiting for the intervention, but Gorky's eyes glided over the crowd without stopping. He was looking at the horizon, at his legacy, at his return to Moscow, where he would be feted as a hero. The ship's whistle blew. It was a long, mournful shriek that echoed off the stone walls of the Kremlin. The lines were cast off. The water churned at the stern. Slowly, agonizingly, the gap between the ship and the dock widened. A foot, a yard, 10 yards. The boy gripped the barbed wire until his hands bled. "He's leaving," he whispered. "He's leaving us." The men around him fell silent. The hope that had sustained them through the night began to curdle into a cold, hard dread. They watched the ship get smaller. They watched the smoke trail fade. They watched the only witness to their suffering disappear into the mist. Gorky was taking their story, but he wasn't taking their burden. He was leaving them behind in the hell he had just inspected. As long as the ship was visible, the guards stood at attention. They were statues of discipline. But the moment the hull of the ship dipped below the horizon, the moment the last wisp of smoke vanished, the atmosphere in the camp snapped. It was as if a physical shield had been removed. The commandant turned around. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic fury. He took off his gloves slowly, finger by finger. He looked at the orchestra and signaled them to stop. The music died in a discordant screech. Silence rushed back in, the terrifying silence of Solovki. Then, the commandant's eyes scanned the rows of prisoners. He didn't have to search. He knew exactly where looking. He looked straight at the boy. "The show is over," the commandant announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent yard. "The guest is gone. The theater is closed. Now, we return to reality." He nodded to 3 guards, the biggest, most brutal men in the detachment. They didn't run. They walked with a slow, deliberate purpose. They walked toward the barbed wire pen where the boy was standing. The other prisoners backed away, creating a wide circle around the child. They wanted to protect him, but the instinct to survive is stronger than the instinct to be a hero. They left him alone in the snow. The boy didn't run. There was nowhere to run. He stood there, watching the wolves approach. He realized then, with a maturity far beyond his 14 years, that he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had thought Gorky's tears were a promise. But tears are just water. They dry up. And now that the writer was gone, safe in his cabin writing his lies, there was no one left to witness what was about to happen. The gate to the pen squeaked open. The guard stepped inside, and for the first time since he had confronted the great writer, the boy began to tremble. The guards didn't speak to the boy. They didn't need to. In the Gulag, language is often replaced by the blunt physics of violence. Two of them grabbed him by the arms, lifting him off the ground until his boots scraped helplessly against the frozen mud. He was light, terribly light, a bundle of bird bones and starvation wrapped in a prisoner's tunic. He didn't scream. Screaming implies that there is someone listening who might help, and the boy knew, with a terrifying clarity, that the only man who could have helped him was currently drinking tea in the first-class cabin of a steamship steaming south. They dragged him past the barracks where the other prisoners watched through the cracks in the wood, their breath held in their chests. They dragged him past the Potemkin tables with their white tablecloths, which were already being stripped away by the logistics crew. The props of the play were being dismantled, and now the unwanted extra was being discarded too. They took him to the back of the ancient monastery, to a place near the old cemetery walls. This spot had seen death for centuries. First the monks who died of old age, and now the enemies of the people who died of bullets. The snow here was different. It was churned up, darker, stained with the layers of history that no fresh snowfall could completely hide. The commandant was waiting there. He was smoking a cigarette, looking bored. To him, this wasn't an execution. It was administrative cleanup. It was deleting a typo from a report. The boy stood shivering in the biting wind. His coat had been torn in the struggle. He looked at the commandant. He didn't beg for his life. Perhaps he was too proud, or perhaps he was just too tired. But he asked one question, a question that would haunt the few men who heard it for the rest of their lives. "Did he know?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Did the writer know you would do this?" The commandant dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. He walked up to the boy, leaning in close. "He knew," the commandant said softly. "He is a smart man. He knows how the world works. Tears are easy, boy. Survival is hard. He chose survival. You chose the truth, and the truth has a price." The commandant stepped back. He nodded to the guard standing behind the boy. There was no blindfold. There was no last cigarette. There was just the metallic click of a Nagant revolver being cocked. The sound was small, insignificant against the vast roar of the wind coming off the white sea. The boy closed his eyes. He probably thought of his mother. He probably thought of the warm room he had stood in just 24 hours ago. Crack. The sound was dull, a flat thud that was swallowed instantly by the snow. The boy crumpled forward. He fell onto the dark earth, his small body looking like a pile of discarded rags. The problem was solved. The witness was silenced. The guards moved quickly. They didn't dig a grave, the ground was too frozen. They simply dragged the body to a pre-dug trench, used for refuse, covered it with lime and rocks, and walked away. 20 minutes later, the camp bell rang for the evening roll call. The prisoners lined up. They noticed the gap in the line where the boy usually stood. No one said a name. No one asked a question. To ask, "Where is he?" was to volunteer to join him. The camp returned to its routine of gray misery. But there was a heaviness in the air that night, a collective despair. They had played by the rules. They had told the truth to the one man who asked for it, and the result was a corpse cooling in the snow. They realized then that there was no savior coming from Moscow. The darkness wasn't an accident, it was the policy. Weeks passed. The ice on the White Sea began to break up, signaling the arrival of a brief, muddy summer. In the camp, the memory of the boy began to fade, replaced by the immediate demands of hunger and lice. But in the back of their minds, the prisoners held onto a sliver of hope. They thought, maybe Gorky is writing. Maybe it takes time. Maybe the book will come out and the world will scream in outrage. And then the newspapers arrived. The camp administration allowed certain Soviet papers to be read by the prisoners, part of the re-education process. One evening, a tattered copy of Izvestia made its way into the barracks. It contained an essay by Maxim Gorky titled Solovki. The prisoner who could read best sat near the stove, the newspaper shaking in his hands. A circle of gaunt faces surrounded him. "Read it," they urged. "Read what he says about the boy." The reader cleared his throat. He began to read aloud. Gorky's prose was beautiful, flowery, and full of revolutionary zeal. He described the boat ride. He described the seagulls. He described the monastery walls. And then he described the camp. "It is strange," Gorky wrote, "to see such prisons. It seems that here the state does not punish but restores. The prisoners are healthy. They work in the fresh air. They are reclaiming their dignity through labor. The prisoners listening in the barracks felt a physical blow, as if they had been punched in the gut. But they kept listening. "Wait," someone whispered. "The boy. He must mention the boy." The reader scanned down the columns. He found a paragraph about the children. Gorky mentioned visiting the children's colony. He wrote about their clean uniforms. He wrote about how well-behaved they were. And then, a single line that might have alluded to the incident, or might have been a complete fabrication. He wrote about the difficult cases, the children who were mentally disturbed by their criminal pasts, whose imaginations ran wild with dark fantasies. He dismissed the boy. He didn't name him. He didn't quote him. He reduced the boy's courageous testimony to the ramblings of a mentally ill delinquent. Gorky had taken the raw, bleeding truth that had been placed in his hands, and he had wrapped it in a layer of beautiful, poisonous lies. He praised the commandant. He praised the guards. He told the world that Solovki was a triumph of the human spirit. The reader lowered the newspaper. Silence filled the room, a silence far worse than the one in the courtyard. This was the silence of absolute betrayal. Gorky hadn't just ignored them. He had sold them. He had traded their suffering for his own comfort, for his dacha in Moscow, for the favor of Stalin. The boy died for nothing. His death wasn't a martyrdom. It was a footnote that had been edited out. The despair that night was total. Men who had survived the winter, who had survived the typhus, simply gave up. They turned their faces to the wall and stopped eating. What was the point of surviving if the world outside refused to see them? But while the prisoners despaired, the camp administration was busy. Gorky's article was a success, yes, but it also created a problem. The article mentioned children. It mentioned re-education. It drew attention to the camp. And in the paranoid logic of the Soviet bureaucracy, attention is dangerous. If people started looking too closely at the records, they might find the boy's name. They might find his intake photo. They might find the report of his execution dated the same day Gorky left. That coincidence was too sharp, too obvious. So the order came down from the Kremlin. It wasn't enough that the boy was dead. It wasn't enough that he was lied about in the press. He had to be erased completely. The damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, began. The archivists went to work in the basement of the administration building. They pulled the files of the year 1929. They looked for a specific name, a specific face, and they lit the stove. The smoke that rose from the chimney that night didn't smell like wood or coal. It smelled like paper. It was the smell of a human being unwritten from history. But erasing a ghost is harder than it looks. The killing of a human being in the Soviet Union was a two-step process. First, you killed the body. That was the easy part. A bullet costs kopecks, and the frozen ground of Solovki is vast enough to hide 1,000 armies. But the second step was harder, and in the eyes of the state, far more important. You had to kill the memory. You had to ensure that the person never existed in the first place. For the boy who confronted Gorky, the physical execution was over in seconds. The bureaucratic execution, however, took weeks, and it was carried out with a meticulous, chilling precision that rivals any horror story ever written. It began in the Spetschaste, the special section of the camp administration. This was the nerve center of the Gulag, a room filled with filing cabinets that smelled of dust and stale tobacco. A clerk, a man whose job was to reduce human lives to ink on paper, was given a specific order from the Kremlin. The visit of Maxim Gorky was being turned into a major propaganda film and a book. The narrative had to be flawless, and a 14-year-old boy who had accused the camp administration of torture was a flaw. He was a stain on the pristine tablecloth of Soviet justice. The clerk pulled the boy's file. It was a thin folder. Inside, there would have been an intake form, fingerprints, and a photograph. That photograph is the erased photo of legend. It would have shown a face not yet hardened by years of survival, a child's face, perhaps looking scared, or perhaps looking defiant. The clerk didn't look at the eyes. He didn't let himself think about the person. He simply took the file, walked to the iron stove in the corner of the room, and opened the door. He threw the papers in. He watched the edges curl and turn black. He watched the face of the boy blister and dissolve into ash. In that moment, the boy ceased to be a prisoner. He became a gap in the sequence of numbers, but the erasure didn't stop there. The administration realized that the mere presence of children in Solovki was a problem. It contradicted the narrative of corrective labor for criminals. So, a purge of the archives began. Photographs that had been taken for internal records, group shots of work brigades where children were visible in the background, were collected. Retouchers, working with razor blades and ink, went to work. They scraped the small figures out of the emulsion. They darkened the shadows to hide the small faces peering out from the bunks. They turned the boy and his peers into unpersons. This activity wasn't just about covering up a murder, it was about rewriting reality. The Soviet Union was trying to create a past that never happened to justify a future that would never arrive. They wanted future historians to look at the records of Solovki and see only healthy adult men happily cutting timber. They wanted the boy's scream to be replaced by the silence of a blank page. But there is a flaw in the logic of erasure. When you remove something from a picture, you leave a mark, you leave a scar on the negative, you leave a vacuum. And in the closed, paranoid world of the Gulag, secrets have a way of becoming radioactive. The guards who knew the truth whispered it to their wives. The prisoners who survived the Gorky visit whispered it to the new arrivals. The erasure was intended to bury the story, but instead, it preserved it in amber. By trying so hard to destroy the evidence of the boy, they turned him into a ghost that haunted the camp. The empty space where he used to stand in the lineup became louder than his voice ever was. The smoke from the burnt file drifted out of the chimney and settled over the island, a physical reminder that something precious had been consumed to keep the lie alive. Years turned into decades. The Solovetsky camp was eventually closed, transformed into a naval base, and then later returned to the Orthodox Church. The wooden barracks rotted away. The barbed wire rusted and disintegrated into the earth. Maxim Gorky died in 1936, officially of pneumonia, though rumors persist that he too was silenced by Stalin when he was no longer useful. The commandant, Eichmanns, was arrested and shot during the Great Purge, a victim of the very machine he had greased with the blood of others. The Soviet Union collapsed, the statues of Lenin were toppled, and in the chaos of the 1990s, the archives were thrown open. Historians and researchers flooded into the dusty basements of the KGB looking for answers. They were looking for the millions of names that had been stolen. They found lists. They found quotas. They found the cold mathematical accounting of genocide. But when they looked for the boy, they found nothing. There was no file. There was no intake photo. There was no record of a conversation with Gorky. According to the official paperwork, the boy never existed. He was a phantom. However, the Soviets had forgotten one thing. The Gulag archipelago was not just a place, it was a memory. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great chronicler of the camps, heard the story. He heard it from the zeks, the prisoners who had passed the legend from mouth to ear, from camp to camp, across the frozen expanse of Siberia. The story of the boy who stood up to Gorky had become a myth, a dark fairy tale that gave prisoners courage. It was the story of the mouse who roared at the lion. Solzhenitsyn wrote it down. He enshrined the boy in the pages of his masterpiece, The Gulag Archipelago. He gave the boy a monument more durable than bronze and taller than the Solovetsky walls. He proved that you can burn paper, but you cannot burn the truth. Today, if you visit the Solovetsky Islands, there is a museum. You can see the photos of the camp. You can see the staged pictures of the happy workers that Gorky admired. But if you look closely at the history, you will see the gaps. You will see the missing faces. And the most powerful image in the history of the Gulag is the one that isn't there. The erased photo of the boy is a symbol. It represents the millions of lives that were not just taken, but stolen. It represents the potential that was strangled in the cradle. But in a strange twist of irony, the erasure failed. We do not remember the names of the guards who shot him. We do not remember the name of the clerk who burned his file. We barely remember the humane lies Gorky wrote in his newspaper article. But we remember the boy. We remember him because his absence is a wound that refuses to heal. He is the missing piece of the puzzle that makes the picture terrifyingly complete. The Soviets tried to delete him to protect their image, but in doing so, they created the ultimate evidence of their crime. The boy stands in the center of history, invisible but undeniable, staring at us with those dark, serious eyes, asking the question that Gorky was too cowardly to answer. Do you see the truth, or are you just looking at the play? The photo is gone. The boy is dust. But the lesson remains. The truth is not what is printed in the newspaper. The truth is what is buried in the frozen ground. And sometimes, the things that are erased are the only things that really matter.